back, dear friends, to another edition of the new show. I'm your host, Random Rob. And today we're going to be looking at David Cronenberg's 1983 psychosexual horror classic, Videodrome. The story of a television producer named Max Wren who stumbles across a pirate TV signal of a sadistic television program called Videodrome and becomes involved in a shadow world of violent hallucinations and corporate espionage. 1983 was really the point when things began to go really well for David Cronenberg. His previous film Scanners had been a big indie horror hit. The public was starting to take notice of his earlier films. He was a director of such promise at this point that George Lucas had even offered him the job of directing Return of the Jedi, which he turned down because he said he didn't ever want to have to direct someone else's work. Interestingly, Videodrome would be one of his only film projects that he would begin without having a finished script. In fact, he wasn't even sure if the producers were going to take him seriously when he pitched it to them, as there was so much sex and violence in the story. Needless to say, the film was greenlit, funding arrived before the script was finished, and Cronenberg, maybe more than any other film he ever directed, would end up collaborating with the actors and crew to fully flesh out Videodrome's weird and apocalyptic narrative. And as usual, I'm going to break down my critique into 3 things you should know about this iconic and disturbing 1983 film. Number 1, pirate TV, sex, violence, and vaginas. David Cronenberg has said in interviews that the seed of Videodrome came to him being a kid in Canada and fiddling with the antenna on his family's television to try to pick up signals from American TV stations late at night. And then it gave him the idea, what if you saw something you weren't supposed to see? I could definitely relate to this because as a teenager, late at night, I went through a period where I was able to pick up little bits of scrambled video from early paid TV networks that were running porn late at night, and I would feverishly try to get the image cleared up so I could make out a grainy image of a breast. This was the era when pay television was new. A lot of the early cable companies that ran content late at night often did show more violent or pornographic content. And Videodrome, despite its lurid horror elements, is a great snapshot of that era. Now, despite there being countless critiques of this film, many of them on YouTube, that argue that Videodrome is social commentary about television and big media, Cronenberg himself said this was never true. His focus was on obsessed characters so bent on changing the environment around them that it physically changes themselves. And in Videodrome, to play devil's advocate with the idea that violent media makes people violent, which is a subject that Cronenberg has very strong opinions on. If you listen to his interviews, he does not buy into the argument that TV viewers are just empty vessels waiting to be filled up with whatever message the TV gives them. So Videodrome's message, if it has one, was to be ironic. In other words, tell a story where the violent media literally makes people violent. The Videodrome signal, turning Max Wren into an instrument of violence, is meant to play havoc with the argument and be ironic. So while I personally don't look at Videodrome as a social commentary film, I do think it's a fascinating meditation on the link between sex and violence, how the obsession with one leads to the other, and how we internalize and externalize our attitudes and feelings about sex and violence. This is why the hallucinatory image of the chest vagina is so important. It's a really blunt visual metaphor for the ideas and concepts that we get from the world and put into ourselves. And not only that, but the idea that a vagina refers to birth too, and that these things we take into our consciousness gestate inside us. This is specifically referenced by Max buying the gun, then losing it in the chest cavity, and then pulling it out later, and that it has now grown and morphed and become a part of his body. In a sense, saying when you pick up a gun, you become infected by the violence of it, and that changes you. And the way in which his gun hand becomes more and more phallic as the movie proceeds is a nod to the way in which violence is sexualized in media. Number 2, Wood's ending. 3 endings were shot for Videodrome. One of the unused endings was going to show Max Wren having killed himself in the real world, awaking within Videodrome, and being confronted by Nikki Brand and Bianca Oblivion, who now have chest vaginas as well, with scary phalluses and tentacles coming out of them. Cronenberg, though, was not a believer in an afterlife and didn't want to put that association within the film, and it was James Woods who would end up suggesting the ending for the film that was used, where he kills himself on the ship and we cut to black. A little bit of trivia about the ending. Videodrome shares a similar distinction as Day of the Dead, 1985, in that both films had a gory climax using real animal guts, which in both cases became unrefrigerated, causing the scene where Captain Rhodes gets torn apart and where the television set explodes at the end of Videodrome to be a very stinky experience for the film crew and the actors. I also wanted to mention there's a story that during the virtual reality headset sequence in Videodrome, James Woods was absolutely certain he was going to get electrocuted if he put the helmet on. No one could convince him otherwise, and so those couple of shots where you see him sitting wearing the headset was actually David Cronenberg wearing James Woods' clothes, the pants of which had to be let out in the back because Cronenberg had wider hips. Number 3, Misrepresenting McLuhan. Now, several characters in Videodrome were based on real-life people. Barry Convex, played wonderfully by Leslie Carlson, was based on televangelist Jim Baker. And media prophet Brian Oblivion, played by Jack Creeley, was based on Marshall McLuhan. And one of McLuhan's most important ideas features prominently in Videodrome, and that's the idea that all technology is an extension of the human body. That tools become part of our hand, the accelerator on our car becomes part of our foot, and that television becomes part of our eye and our brain. But Oblivion's message in Videodrome is really at odds with what Marshall McLuhan was actually talking about. And I don't know if this was intentional on Cronenberg's part or if he was misreading him. I mean, at the end of the day, it's artistic contrivance anyway. When I first saw Videodrome, I had never heard of Marshall McLuhan, and I was surprised later on when I read The Medium is the Message and saw television interviews with him from the 60s and 70s that McLuhan was never trying to promote television as a societal positive, but he was a person who spoke very carefully and often very obtusely. And I think this had to do with the fact that he did not want to be a man on television directly condemning television. I think he's someone who has always been a little misunderstood, his quotations often being mischaracterized. Hillary Clinton, for example, famously borrowing his phrase, "a global village." When he said television was turning the world into a global village, he didn't mean people were being brought closer together. Rather, just the opposite. That television by its nature was a medium that triggered emotional responses in the viewer before they had a chance to think about what they were watching. and that this hair-trigger reactionary quality of consuming television had the effect of making people more reactionary, more irritable, and more tribal. The global village he was talking about was not an evolved place. Cronenberg himself said on the most recent Blu-ray commentary that although McLuhan was teaching at the university that he was at, he never took a class with him. Again, this isn't something that takes away from the film. It's just something that I wonder about when I watch it, whether Cronenberg really got what McLuhan was saying. So, do I think Videodrome still holds up? Absolutely. One thing I love about this film is the way it makes you feel when you're watching it. Dirty. And as a freeform exploration of the sex and violence that we put into our heads and how it affects us, there's really no other film like it. Cronenberg was probably one of the most important pioneers of sci-fi horror of that era. And despite the commercial success that would come later on for him, I'd say Videodrome is easily his most distinctive and important work. So what do you think about Videodrome? Let me know in the comments below. And if you like what you heard, press the like button and subscribe. And consider becoming a patron of the new show. I could use your help. Alright, this is Random Rob, signing off till next time. Be excellent, and take care. The new show is made possible by generous support from viewers like Tony, Arnell, Skipnick, Christopher, Marion, Eric, and B. Thank you so much for your support.